They did not take his business with violence. They took it with paperwork. In the spring of 1941, the documents arrived folded neatly inside a brown envelope, stamped and signed by men who spoke in calm voices and avoided eye contact. The language was administrative, almost courteous. Temporary reassignment, protective oversight, wartime necessity. Nothing in the wording suggested theft. Isaac Rosenfeld read the letter twice before understanding what it meant. The factory he had built over 20 years, brick by brick, contract by contract, was no longer his. He was instructed to cooperate, to assist with the transition, to ensure continuity. His experience, the letter said, would be valuable to all parties involved. He was 49 years old. He had employees who had worked for him since their youth. He knew the machines by sound, could tell when a belt was misaligned before anyone else noticed. He had believed, foolishly, that productivity created protection. It didn't. The morning he arrived at the factory after receiving the notice, the gates were already open. The guards recognized him. That was the cruelest detail. They nodded politely and stepped aside, allowing him to enter a place that now belonged to someone else. Inside, nothing had changed. The machines ran. The foreman followed routines Isaac had designed. The smell of oil and metal filled the air exactly as it always had. Continuity had been preserved, just not ownership. Isaac stood near the office door and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not panic, displacement. He was still useful, just no longer entitled. This story is not about losing money. It is about what happens when survival requires you to cooperate in your own erasure. During the months that followed, Isaac was kept on as a consultant. The title was generous. The reality was precise. He was expected to explain processes, introduce contacts, resolve bottlenecks. Every solution he provided strengthened a system that no longer included him. He was paid enough to live, not enough to leave. He learned to measure his words, to offer guidance without revealing too much, to preserve fragments of authority without appearing defiant. It was a delicate balance, being useful enough to remain tolerated, but replaceable enough not to be considered dangerous. Then came the camps. Isaac survived them not because of strength, but because of habit. He knew how systems worked. He knew when to speak and when silence produced better outcomes. By the time the war ended, he carried fewer illusions than possessions. When he returned to his hometown years later, the factory was still there. Larger now, more efficient, a new name painted above the entrance. The original sign, his sign, had been removed so cleanly it left no scar on the brick. The man who owned it now greeted Isaac warmly. "You should be proud," he said. "What you built endured." Then, almost casually, he added, "But it's better for everyone if we don't talk too much about how things changed." The sentence landed with terrifying familiarity. Isaac realized then that the war had not ended his relationship with the factory. It had simply changed the terms. They had taken his business during the war. Now, in peace, they were asking him for something far more valuable than silence. They were asking him for agreement. And Isaac had to decide whether survival had taught him how to refuse or only how to endure. Isaac understood the request immediately. Staying quiet was not about avoiding conflict, it was about preserving legitimacy. If he spoke, the factory's history would fracture, ownership would become conditional, continuity would be exposed as curated. Silence, on the other hand, allowed the past to harden into something unchallengeable. Before the war, Isaac had believed that businesses remembered their founders. They did not. They remembered efficiency. He walked the factory floor slowly, noticing changes, new machines, expanded lines, workers who did not recognize him. A few older faces stiffened when they saw him, then relaxed when he offered a neutral nod. He had learned long ago that acknowledgement could be dangerous. The looming shadow followed him everywhere. Gratitude. People thanked him for not making trouble, for being understanding, for recognizing that times were complicated. The language was careful, rehearsed. Gratitude was the town's way of preemptively absolving itself. The early fracture came when Isaac reviewed a production ledger left open on a desk. The numbers were familiar, the structure unmistakably his, margins optimized in the exact way he had taught. The factory had not merely survived on his ideas, it had scaled them. His absence had been profitable. That night, Isaac slept poorly, replaying conversations with unnerving clarity. He realized that survival had trained him to accept partial truths. In the camps, that skill had kept him alive. Here, it threatened to erase him. The micro-twist arrived through a letter. A local committee invited him to attend a small gathering celebrating industrial resilience during the war. His factory was listed as a success story. His name was not mentioned. The omission was deliberate, polite, efficient. Isaac understood the implication. He was welcome as long as he remained invisible. The moral dilemma sharpened. If he attended, he would legitimize the narrative that his work had simply outlived him. If he declined, questions might arise. Questions attracted attention. Attention destabilized comfort. He remembered how easily systems rewarded compliance. He also remembered how easily they punished deviation. Isaac chose a third option. He wrote a short reply accepting the invitation on one condition: that the history presented include accurate attribution of original ownership. The wording was calm, factual, impossible to misinterpret. The response came quickly. They thanked him for his thoughtful suggestion and explained that revisiting ownership details would complicate the event's purpose. They hoped he understood. Isaac folded the letter carefully. Complication was the purpose. He realized then that the factory had not been taken only once. It was being taken again, this time through memory, through omission, through a story that required his silence to remain intact. As Isaac placed the letter back into his coat, he understood the shape of the fight ahead. This would not be about reclaiming assets. It would be about reclaiming authorship. And authorship, he knew, threatened far more than ownership ever could. Isaac began to collect proof the way he had once collected contracts, quietly, systematically, without announcing the purpose. He visited old suppliers first, men who had signed invoices in rooms that smelled of ink and tobacco, men who remembered names because names had once meant stability. Some refused to speak. Others spoke too softly, eyes scanning doorways as if the war might still be listening. A few admitted the truth in fragments. The transfer had been temporary, then quietly finalized. Signatures had appeared for convenience. The founder's absence had created opportunity that no one wanted to call theft. The micro-twist came when Isaac discovered how many people had convinced themselves they had done him a favor. "You would have lost it anyway," one man told him, almost kindly. "At least it stayed in the town. At least the workers kept their jobs." Isaac heard the logic clearly. It was the same logic used everywhere, in every system that benefited from someone's removal. It reframed taking as protection. It reframed theft as stewardship. It turned advantage into duty. The early fracture sharpened when Isaac found an old ledger in a back office of the municipal archives. His handwriting was there, not just his signature, his annotations, notes about machine maintenance, payroll adjustments, efficiency improvements. The foundation of the factory's expansion had been built on pages that still carried his mind. But the ownership records attached to the same period listed another name. The discrepancy was not accidental, it was engineered. Isaac realized then that the town's request to stay quiet was not only moral, it was legal. Silence protected property lines that had been drawn quickly, then defended by time. If Isaac spoke, the factory could become a contested object, not just financially, socially. It would force people to admit that their stability rested on an unspoken agreement. The moral dilemma deepened. Truth would cost more than money. Workers might lose jobs, families might lose standing, the town might fracture under the weight of its own history. People who had never signed the original documents might still suffer from their consequences. Isaac understood this intimately. Survival had taught him that systems distribute pain unevenly, then call it necessity. The looming shadow returned in a new form, politeness with edges. The current owner, Carl, invited Isaac to lunch. The restaurant was modest but chosen carefully, public enough to discourage confrontation. Carl spoke warmly, praised Isaac's vision, recounted the factory's growth as if telling a shared story. Then he lowered his voice. "I've heard you've been asking questions," Carl said. "It makes people nervous." Isaac met his eyes. "It should." Carl's smile tightened. "You're a survivor," he replied gently. "People respect that. But you don't want to be remembered as the man who came back and ruined everything." There it was. Not a threat, a framing, a story offered in advance, designed to trap Isaac inside it. If he pursued truth, he would be recast as selfish, vindictive, disruptive. The town had prepared a moral label to protect itself. Isaac left the lunch understanding something essential. The factory was not the only thing at stake. His identity was being negotiated too. They had taken his business during the war. Now they were trying to take his right to speak about it afterward. And Isaac had to decide whether he would accept the role they had written for him or rewrite it at the cost of becoming the town's villain. Isaac chose visibility. Not loudly, not dramatically. He understood better than anyone that spectacle invited dismissal. What he chose instead was precision, the kind that systems could not easily absorb or reframe. He submitted a formal request to the Regional Economic Office, attaching copies of the documents he had gathered. No accusations, no emotional language, just timelines, signatures, continuity of process. He framed the question narrowly, whether wartime temporary stewardship had ever been legally reviewed after the war ended. The micro-twist arrived in the response. The office acknowledged receipt and requested clarification, not about ownership, but about Isaac himself. Proof of identity, proof of residence before the war, proof that he was, in fact, the same person named in the early ledgers. The implication was subtle, but unmistakable. Before they could revisit the factory's history, Isaac's right to exist within it had to be revalidated. He complied. Birth records, school certificates, a marriage document saved by chance. Each paper felt heavier than it should have, not because it was fragile, but because it reminded him how often existence itself required documentation. While he waited, the town adjusted its posture. The owner stopped inviting him to lunch. Neighbors grew careful again, eyes sliding away mid-conversation. The factory gates no longer opened as readily when Isaac approached. Nothing overt had changed. Everything had. The looming shadow became isolation. This was familiar terrain. In the camps, isolation had been imposed brutally. Here it was curated, socially enforced. Isaac recognized it as the same mechanism operating under different conditions. Silence as pressure, distance as warning. The moral dilemma sharpened when a former employee visited him late one evening. The man stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in his hands. He spoke quickly, as if he afraid he might lose momentum. "People are talking. They're saying the factory could be shut down if this goes too far. The jobs could be lost." Isaac listened without interruption. "You don't owe us anything," the man added, "but you built something that feeds families. Maybe that matters more now than what's written on paper." After he left, Isaac sat alone for a long time. The question was no longer abstract. His pursuit of truth now carried visible risk for others. This was the kind of dilemma he knew well, the kind that forced you to weigh justice against collateral harm, clarity against consequence. The secret act came quietly. When the regional office asked him to submit a public statement outlining his claims, Isaac declined. Instead, he requested a private review. He narrowed the scope again. He removed language that might trigger immediate enforcement. He chose delay over escalation. Not retreat, control. Isaac understood then that survival had taught him something useful after all. Not how to endure silently, but how to navigate systems without becoming consumed by them. He would not allow his story to be turned into a spectacle, nor would he allow it to be buried again. Weeks passed. Then a second letter arrived. The office confirmed irregularities, transfers that did not meet post-war standards, documentation that relied too heavily on assumed continuity. A review would proceed carefully. The factory's status was no longer unquestioned. Isaac folded the letter and felt neither triumph nor relief, only resolve. The process he had set in motion would move slowly now, constrained by caution and resistance, but it would move. They had taken his business during the war. Now, decades later, they were being forced to explain how permanence had been built on something labeled temporary. And Isaac knew that explanation, once demanded, could not be quietly withdrawn. The review did not unfold the way Isaac had imagined. There were no dramatic inspections, no public announcements, no officials marching through the factory with clipboards. Instead, the process seeped into the town like dampness, slow, invisible, impossible to ignore once it settled. Requests for clarification were sent, counterstatements submitted, dates questioned, language debated. Each exchange stripped a little more certainty from the story the town had relied on for decades. The micro-twist came from an unexpected place. A junior clerk from the regional office wrote to Isaac privately, not officially, not on letterhead. The message was brief and careful. She explained that many wartime transfers had never been reviewed, not because they were legal, but because reviewing them would require acknowledging how widespread the practice had been. "If yours is reopened," she wrote, "others will be too." Isaac read the sentence several times. The factory was no longer the center of the issue. It was the entry point. His case threatened to destabilize a broader settlement, one built on the quiet agreement that reopening the past was too costly to justify. The moral dilemma sharpened again. If Isaac pressed forward fully, the inquiry would widen, more claims, more disputes, more families forced to confront uncomfortable origins. If he withdrew now, the system would stabilize again, and his factory would remain an exception never officially acknowledged. He was being offered an unspoken compromise, resolution without precedent. The town sensed it. People began approaching Isaac cautiously, as if testing boundaries. A shopkeeper mentioned how grateful everyone was that things had not become messy. A neighbor suggested that dignity sometimes meant letting history rest. The language had shifted from warning to persuasion. Then came the visit. Carl arrived unannounced one afternoon, standing in Isaac's doorway with an expression carefully calibrated between concern and authority. He did not sit, he did not remove his coat. "I've been advised to speak with you directly, off the record," Carl said. He explained that the review could be concluded quietly, a settlement, formal recognition of Isaac as founder, symbolic, archival, contained. In exchange, ownership would remain unchanged, jobs protected, stability preserved. "It's a fair outcome," Carl said. "Everyone keeps something." Isaac understood the offer immediately. It was not about fairness, it was about containment. The small, secret act arrived in the moment Isaac responded. He did not reject the proposal outright. Instead, he asked a single question: "Will the settlement be public?" He hesitated. Too long. "That wouldn't be necessary," he said finally. Isaac nodded. The answer was enough. That evening, Isaac added one more document to the file he had been preparing, a personal statement, not emotional, not accusatory, detailing the exact sequence by which his factory had been transferred, managed, and normalized. He did not submit it yet. He simply ensured it existed. He understood now that the final decision was approaching. Either his story would be absorbed, flattened into a footnote that protected everyone's comfort, or it would remain unresolved long enough to force the question no one wanted asked: who benefits when silence is called peace, and who pays for it? The factory lights glowed in the distance as Isaac closed his window. They had taken his business during the war. Now they were offering him memory without consequence, and Isaac knew that accepting it would cost him something he had already lost once and refused to lose again. Isaac left the town before the review concluded. Not abruptly, not in protest. He understood the value of timing. Staying would turn him into a symbol again, either of greed or disruption, depending on who was speaking. Leaving allowed the process to continue without requiring him to absorb every consequence personally. The micro-twist came months later through the mail. The regional office sent a formal notice. The factory's wartime transfer had been ruled procedurally flawed. The language was careful, almost apologetic. Ownership would not be reversed, but the ruling required that the original transfer be recorded as illegitimate and that the factory's public records include the founder's name with an explicit annotation explaining the circumstances of removal. It was not restitution, it was correction. The town reacted unevenly. Some dismissed the ruling as symbolic. Others resented it openly. A few, quietly, were relieved. The factory remained operational, jobs were preserved, but the story that had protected everyone's comfort had cracked. Permanence now carried an asterisk. Isaac felt the echo of it in unexpected places. An old supplier wrote to him, apologizing for not knowing how to speak earlier. A former employee admitted he had told his children the factory's origin incorrectly for years. A student from the town's school asked if she could interview him about how businesses survive wars. Isaac answered selectively. He did not explain the camps. He did not describe deprivation. He spoke instead about systems, how order could disguise theft, how gratitude could be weaponized, how silence was often requested not to prevent harm but to preserve advantage. The breadcrumb object returned quietly. Isaac took out the original contract, the first one he had signed decades earlier. The paper was brittle now, the ink faded. It no longer had legal power, but it carried authorship. It named the moment when something had been created honestly, without fear or negotiation. He placed it back in its folder, not as evidence, but as reminder. Years later, a small plaque appeared near the factory entrance. It did not accuse anyone. It did not name beneficiaries. It stated only that the factory had been founded by Isaac Rosenfeld, that ownership had been transferred during the war under temporary authority, and that the transfer had never been reviewed until decades later. People read it quickly. Some looked away. Others stopped. That was the difference. The town did not fall apart. It did not redeem itself either. It adjusted, slowly, awkwardly, to a version of its history that resisted simplification. The cost of remembering became part of the landscape. Isaac never returned there to live. He did not need to. The long echo had arrived, not as justice, but as accuracy. And accuracy, he had learned, was often the most durable form of resistance. They had taken his business during the war, but they could not keep the story intact once it refused to stay quiet. In his final years, Isaac was careful with how he told the story. He never framed it as a victory. He avoided the language of loss when he could. Loss implied something accidental, something that simply happened. What he had lived through had been structured, deliberate, maintained by agreement long after the urgency of war had passed. When people asked him if it was worth it, worth reopening old wounds, worth unsettling a town that had moved on, Isaac answered slowly. "Moving on is easy," he said. "What's difficult is deciding what you're willing to carry with you." The factory continued to operate. New workers came and went. The plaque became part of the entrance, glanced at by some, ignored by others. It did not change wages. It did not reverse ownership, but it altered the story just enough to resist erasure. That mattered. Isaac understood something that took him a lifetime to articulate. Power is rarely interested in silence for moral reasons. Silence is requested because it preserves speed, efficiency, advantage. Speaking interrupts those flows. Even when it changes nothing material, it forces systems to slow down and account for themselves. The breadcrumb object, the original contract, remained in his possession until the end. He never donated it, never framed it. He kept it folded, exactly as it had been when he signed it, ink still faintly visible where his hand had pressed too hard. It was not nostalgia, it was orientation, a reminder of authorship in a world that had tried to convert creation into opportunity for others. Near the end of his life, Isaac wrote a short note and placed it inside the folder. It contained no names, no accusations, only one sentence. Silence is not peace if it is purchased with someone else's disappearance. That was all. Isaac died without reclaiming his business, his position, or his place in the town's daily life. But he did something quieter and more durable. He made it harder for what happened to be described as inevitable. The war had taken his business. Peace had tried to take his silence. He refused the second loss. And in doing so, Isaac left behind something more enduring than ownership, a record that could not be smoothed over without effort, a story that resisted convenience, a reminder that what survives is not always what endures best. Sometimes survival is not about getting something back. It is about ensuring that what was taken can no longer pretend it was freely given.